On Christmas morning, my son called from Vancouver and asked me something that stopped me cold. Dad, is the $4,500 Sandra sends you every month enough to cover your prescriptions and the physio? I was standing in my kitchen in Kingston, Ontario, still in my bathrobe, holding a mug of coffee that had already gone lukewarm. I set it down on the counter very carefully. Son, I said, what money are you talking about? The only help I get is my CPP and OAS. That's all. There was silence on the line. Then my son said, slowly, like a man who has just noticed the floor beneath him isn't solid, Dad, I've been sending that money for 4 years. Before I continue, I want to ask you to subscribe to Subtle Vengeance and leave a comment below telling me where you're watching from. It helps more than you know. My name is Walter Morrison. I'm 68 years old. I spent 32 years as a staff sergeant with the RCMP detachment here in Kingston, and before I retired, I was the kind of man who could read a scene before he walked into it. Inconsistencies bothered me the way a crooked picture bothers other people. I noticed things. I logged things. I kept records, which is why what happened to me over the past 4 years is something I'll have to live with in a particular way. Not because I was foolish, but because I trusted the wrong person in the one place I thought I was safe. My own family. Let me take you back to Christmas Eve, 2 years after my wife Margaret passed. Our son Daniel had driven down from Vancouver with his wife Sandra and their daughter Lily, who was 4 years old and absolutely convinced that the reindeer on my front lawn decorations were real. Sandra had married Daniel 6 years earlier in a quiet ceremony at a vineyard in the Okanagan. She was an accountant by training, sharp and organized, and I had respected those qualities even if I had never entirely warmed to her. She managed their finances. Daniel had told me early in the marriage that Sandra had a gift for it, that numbers made sense to her the way crime scenes made sense to me. He trusted her completely, and I understood that kind of trust. When you work alongside someone every day, and they never give you reason to doubt, doubt feels almost disloyal. The trouble with that kind of trust is that it has no built-in alarm system. Sandra had always looked at my house on Clergy Street the way a building inspector looks at a condemned property. She walked through my rooms with her arms slightly away from her body, as though contact with my furniture might transfer something unpleasant onto her coat. On Christmas Eve, she stood in my living room holding a glass of red wine and commented that the carpeting in the hallway was a trip hazard. Dad, honestly, for someone your age, that runner is a liability. She said it with the tone of someone being generous with their concern. I had bought that runner at a market with Margaret in 2004. I said nothing. Her brother Kevin had been living with me since the previous January. 11 months by that Christmas. Sandra had called in the spring of that year and said Kevin was going through a difficult transition, that he'd left his apartment in Toronto after a job loss, and could he stay with me for a few months while he got back on his feet. She said it the way people say things when they've already decided the answer. I had an empty spare room. I said yes. Kevin was 41 and had the particular energy of a man who has never been fully inconvenienced by anything. He slept until 10, most mornings, left dishes in the sink, and had opinions about the television that he shared freely, whether I was watching or not. He wasn't cruel, exactly. He just had the certainty of someone who believes that other people's spaces exist for his comfort. By Christmas, I had stopped eating dinner at my own dining table because Kevin had installed himself there with his laptop and his delivery orders and his headphones around his neck, always halfway through something he was watching and never quite ready to pause it. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself Daniel was busy and Sandra had arranged this out of genuine family feeling. On Christmas morning, after Daniel called, I sat at my kitchen table for a long time. My coffee was cold. Outside, a light snow was coming down over the street Lawrence, the kind of Kingston winter morning that Margaret used to call a good excuse to stay in. I did not stay in. I went to the filing cabinet in my study, the one I had kept organized since 1989, and I pulled out my financial records for the past 4 years. I am a thorough man by training and by nature. I had every bank statement, every CPP deposit slip, every OAS payment, every OHIP reimbursement confirmation. I spread them across my desk and went through them the way I used to go through evidence logs. There was no $4,500. There was no transfer of any kind, from Daniel, from Sandra, from any account I didn't recognize. My income for the past 4 years had been exactly what it always was. CPP at $1,140 per month. OAS at $698. A small pension supplement from the RCMP. Total, after the clawback on my pension, approximately $2,600 monthly. Out of that, I paid my mortgage, my utilities, my prescriptions for blood pressure, and the knee medication that ran me $180 a month. My groceries, my car insurance. I had asked the church 3 months ago for help covering a dental procedure because my plan didn't cover the full amount. $240. I had felt the embarrassment of it for weeks. 4 years. $4,500 per month. I did the calculation with a pencil on the back of an envelope because I wanted to feel the numbers in my hand. $216,000. I called Daniel back within the hour. He arrived 2 days after Christmas, alone, having told Sandra he needed to handle some business with my estate planning. He looked the way he had looked at his mother's funeral, that particular exhaustion that comes not from sleeplessness, but from the failure of something you believed in. He sat across from me at the dining table. Kevin had conveniently left to visit a friend for the day, which told me something. Daniel pulled out his phone and showed me the e-transfer records. Every month for 48 months. Recipient listed as W. Morrison Home Care Fund. The confirmation emails showed successful transfers. The money had gone somewhere. Sandra set up the account, he said. She handles all our household transfers. She said she'd been sending it directly to a dedicated account she opened in your name to manage the payments and track receipts for tax purposes. A dedicated account in my name that I had never been told about, never signed for, never received a statement from. I kept my voice level. 32 years in the RCMP teaches you that the moment you raise your voice, the conversation stops being useful. Daniel, I need you to call the bank today and ask them specifically about any account opened in my name or with my SIN number that you or Sandra have access to. He made the call from my kitchen while I watched. The bank representative confirmed it within 4 minutes. There was a personal savings account opened in my name, with Sandra listed as the sole account manager. I was listed as the nominal account holder. I had no online access, no debit card, had never received paper statements. Sandra had set the account correspondence to go to a Gmail address I had never seen. My son's face when he heard that went very still. Sandra called while Daniel was still sitting at my table. She had figured out, somehow, that the conversation had moved in a direction she hadn't planned for. Her voice on speaker was warm and explanatory, the way voices get when they're constructing something in real time. Walter, sweetheart, of course you don't receive direct deposits. The account is structured as a managed care fund. It's a tax efficiency thing. The money accumulates, and I draw from it when there are expenses. It's all above board. I can send you a summary. Sandra, Daniel said, and his voice had changed in a way I had not heard before. What expenses? Dad applied for help from the church to cover a dental bill. He sold his winter coat last February because he couldn't cover the hydro and groceries both. What expenses have you been paying from this account? The pause on Sandra's end lasted 4 seconds. I counted. It's complicated, Daniel. There have been coordination fees, financial management costs. I've been doing significant work to manage this. Show me one receipt, Daniel said. One receipt for one expense related to my father's care. She said she would need to gather the documents. She said she would call back. She did not call back. That night, Daniel and I sat in my living room, and I walked him through what I had already started to understand. I did not accuse. I presented. I showed him my bank records laid out chronologically. The absence of any transfer across 4 full years. I showed him the dental paperwork from the church. I showed him my grocery receipts from months when I had switched to the discount store on Bath Road to save $40. I showed him my prescription records. I told him that I wasn't angry with him, that I had understood from the beginning of his marriage that Sandra managed money, and that this division of responsibility made sense to him. That trust given without cause for suspicion isn't stupidity. It's what marriage is supposed to mean." He cried then, quietly. I let him. The next morning, Kevin came back and found an atmosphere in the house that even he could read. He made himself scarce, which was the most useful thing he had done in 11 months. Daniel drove back to Vancouver on December 28th. Before he left, he told me two things. First, that he was going to review every account Sandra managed, starting that day. Second, that he was going to call a family lawyer. He also asked me to be careful about Kevin. He said it quietly, at the door. "Dad, I don't think Kevin's being here is an accident." I had suspected the same thing for several months. January in Kingston is a serious month. The cold settles in without negotiating. I spent the first 2 weeks of that January doing what I used to do when I caught a case that required patience. I gathered. I organized. I did not confront anyone prematurely. I called TD Bank and requested a formal review of the account opened in my name, citing that I had not consented to its creation and had never been informed of its existence. The fraud department opened a file. They confirmed the account had been opened using a copy of my SIN that Sandra had on file from their joint tax returns. The account had received $216,000 over 48 months. Current balance, $2,300. The rest had been spent. Daniel emailed me the transaction records his lawyer had subpoenaed. I printed them at the Kingston Public Library on Princess Street, standing at the machine while it ran through 93 pages. 53 cents a page. I counted out exact change. At my dining table, with Kevin's cereal bowl still sitting unwashed in the sink and the smell of his coffee still in the air, I went through every transaction. I used a yellow highlighter for personal purchases and a blue one for cash withdrawals and a red one for transfers to a second account I didn't recognize. The pattern was precise. Sandra had spent methodically, not extravagantly in any single burst, but consistently and without hesitation. Anthropology, $2,400. Spa treatments at a resort in Whistler, $3,800. A wine club membership, $180 monthly for 3 years. Business class flights to Toronto and back, 3 times. Listed under client meetings. A kitchen renovation, quote, paid as deposit, $8,500 to a contractor in their neighborhood. Cash withdrawals averaging $1,200 per month, steady as a heartbeat. Not one transaction related to my health. Not a pharmacy receipt, not a physiotherapy clinic, not a specialist copay. Nothing. The second account received transfers totaling $31,000. That account was in Kevin's name. I sat with that for a moment, looked at Kevin's cereal bowl in my sink, looked at the spot on the carpet by the front door where he left his shoes in a pile every day, regardless of how many times I'd asked him to use the rack. Margaret had hung there in 2007. Then I went to my filing cabinet and pulled out the folder labeled House Documents. Daniel called the same evening. His voice had the clipped quality of a man who had been talking to lawyers all day. "Dad, Sandra knows I've been pulling the account records. She's started moving money. Her lawyer sent me a letter this morning saying she's filing for separation and that I have a pattern of financial control and emotional manipulation." "Do you have a family lawyer in Vancouver?" I asked. "I retained one this morning." "Good. Tell them about Lily first, before anything else. Make sure the separation filing doesn't give Sandra grounds to limit your access to your daughter." "Dad, she's already told Lily that I'm going away for a while because I'm upset." I pressed my hand flat on the table, breathed slowly. In for 4 counts, out for 6, the way the cardiologist had told me. Document every communication with Lily, every time Sandra limits your access, everything Lily says to you about what she's been told. You'll need that record. January 18th, I took a bus to a legal clinic on Brock Street. Legal Aid Ontario had a walk-in program for seniors on fixed income, and I qualified 3 times over. The duty lawyer was a woman named Carol Hadley, maybe 45. With reading glasses, she kept taking off and putting back on as she went through my documents. She spent 40 minutes reviewing everything without speaking. Then she looked up. "Mr. Morrison, I've handled a lot of civil cases in the last 20 years. You've done most of the work already." I was Staff Sergeant RCMP for 32 years. Evidence management was my trade. She referred me to a civil litigation lawyer named Robert Park, who took cases involving elder financial abuse on a partial contingency arrangement. I met with Park the following week. He was Korean-Canadian, mid-50s, organized and direct, the kind of lawyer who doesn't use 3 sentences when one will do. He looked at my documentation and said he would take the case for 30% of recovery plus filing costs. I wrote him a retainer check for $400. It was the last of my savings from the previous month. On the bus home, I watched the city go by. The limestone buildings along King Street, the gray water of the Cataraqui. I had spent 32 years in this city, protecting people from the kind of person my daughter-in-law turned out to be. I did not feel sorry for myself. I felt focused. February brought a development I had been half expecting. Daniel discovered, through his lawyer's document request, that Sandra had paid a deposit on a lot in Kelowna raw land, $22,000, listed under a numbered company she had incorporated 18 months earlier. The numbered company's sole director was Kevin Beaumont. She had been using my son's money, funneled through an account she opened in my name, to capitalize a shell company run by her brother, who was living in my house to keep the logistics close and to keep me from asking too many questions. I told Park about the Kelowna property. He said it changed our case from unjust enrichment to something more serious. The numbered company gave us a paper trail that showed coordination and planning, not opportunism. This isn't someone who dipped into a fund when she was short 1 month, Park said. This is a scheme. It was built with a structure. How do we use that? We add conversion and fraudulent misrepresentation to the claim. We also report the numbered company to the CRA and to the BC Securities Commission. I filed the CRA report myself. I had all the documentation organized in a binder with color-coded tabs. The intake officer on the phone told me it was the most complete voluntary disclosure package she had received from a private individual in years. Meanwhile, Kevin. On a Tuesday morning in late February, I came downstairs to find the door to my study standing open. I always kept it closed. Kevin was in the kitchen eating toast, facing away from me. Nothing appeared disturbed, but my filing cabinet drawer was not pushed fully closed. I had not been in that cabinet in 4 days. I said nothing. I went back upstairs, photographed the partially open drawer, photographed the position of the folders inside, texted the images to Park with a timestamp. Then I moved my most critical documents, the originals of everything, to a fireproof lockbox I had kept in my bedroom closet since my RCMP days. I had used it for weapons storage certificates and sensitive case documents. It had a combination lock. Kevin did not know it existed. That afternoon, I called Daniel. Your brother-in-law went through my study, I said. Nothing was taken, but they know I've been building a file. Should you ask him to leave? Not yet. The moment he leaves, Sandra knows exactly where we stand. Right now, she's guessing. Let her guess. Sandra called me on the last day of February. She called my landline, which almost nobody used anymore. Her voice was carefully measured, the way voices get when they've been coached. Walter, I think there's been a terrible misunderstanding. I've been managing that account so carefully, trying to protect the money from tax complications, and I realize now I should have explained the structure better. I feel awful that you've been struggling. I had no idea. Sandra, I said, the account has been active for 4 years. In 4 years, you never called to confirm my care needs, never sent a statement, never asked if the money was sufficient. In 4 years, not $1 reached me for any purpose. A pause. I know how it looks. I want to make this right. Can we sit down together, just the two of us, and talk through the details before this gets to lawyers? I had been recording the call from the moment I recognized her number. Ontario is a one-party consent province. Park had confirmed this for me in our second meeting. Sandra, I said, I think the lawyers are better placed to handle the details. I'll let mine know you're open to discussion. She did not call again. March arrived and Park filed our civil claim in the Ontario Superior Court of Justice. The claim named Sandra Beaumont Morrison as defendant. Causes of action: unjust enrichment, conversion, breach of constructive trust, fraudulent misrepresentation. We sought recovery of $216,000 principal, interest at the Ontario prescribed rate of 5% annually compounded, general damages, and costs. Total claim, just over $280,000. Simultaneously, Park filed a motion for a Mareva injunction, a court order freezing Sandra's accessible assets while the case proceeded, preventing her from moving money to places a judgment couldn't reach. The motion relied on the evidence of the Kelowna property and the numbered company, which demonstrated her capacity and willingness to structure assets to avoid accountability. The judge granted the injunction within 5 days. Sandra's Vancouver lawyer sent a letter to Park describing me as a confused, elderly man whose cognitive decline had led him to misinterpret normal family financial arrangements. The letter included an affidavit from Kevin. I want to describe what it is like to read, in notarized legal language, that you are a confused and forgetful old man. Kevin wrote that I had frequently misplaced documents and forgotten conversations, that I had once told him I received no money from Daniel, and then an hour later described a transfer Daniel had made to my account, and that I had grown increasingly paranoid in recent months. He wrote that I had accused Sandra of stealing without any factual basis. I read that affidavit at my kitchen table on a Tuesday evening. Kevin was watching television in the other room. I could hear the laugh track. I called Park the next morning and told him I wanted a formal cognitive assessment. He said he had anticipated this and had already contacted a neuropsychologist at Kingston Health Sciences Center. I had the assessment 2 weeks later. 3 hours of memory tests, pattern recognition, verbal reasoning, processing speed. The psychologist, a man named Dr. Osei, told me afterward that my results were well above average for my age cohort. He said my memory scores in particular were in the top 15% for men between 65 and 70. I asked him to prepare the most detailed written report his format allowed. He said he would. I also asked my cardiologist to write a letter confirming that I had been actively engaged with my own medical care, that I had attended every appointment independently, managed my own medications, and demonstrated full capacity throughout our years as patient and physician. She provided the letter the same week. I brought both documents to Park's office and set them on his desk. Kevin called me forgetful, I said. Let the record show what my memory is actually like. Kevin received his eviction notice in the 3rd week of March. Park had prepared an application under the Residential Tenancies Act based on the specific facts. Sole ownership of the property since 1991, no written tenancy agreement, no rent paid, original arrangement explicitly described as temporary. Kevin had no lease. He had no documentation of any oral agreement beyond Sandra's description of a temporary stay. Kevin's response was to produce a text message from Sandra saying I had confirmed Kevin was always welcome to stay. My text records showed nothing of the kind. The text was from Sandra's phone to Kevin's, and I was not a party to it. The eviction hearing was set for the 2nd week of April. On a Saturday morning 2 weeks before the hearing, I came downstairs to find a large crack running through the drywall above the kitchen doorframe. I had not heard anything in the night. The crack was fresh, the edges bright white. A hammer or a fist, I thought. I photographed it, called Park. He added it to the documentation file under property damage. Kevin stood in the kitchen eating cereal and said he hadn't heard anything either. The eviction hearing took 40 minutes. I wore the suit I had worn at my retirement ceremony from the RCMP. I brought my original house deed, my mortgage discharge from 2017, and a complete history of utility bills in my name since 1991. Kevin brought Sandra's text message and a handwritten list of services he claimed to have provided in exchange for housing, including grocery trips and basic maintenance. The adjudicator asked Kevin to describe the maintenance he had performed. He named 3 things: changing a light bulb, bringing in the recycling bins once, and general help around the house. The adjudicator asked whether he had any receipts for materials purchased, any documentation of hours, any written record of the arrangement. Kevin said it had all been informal. The adjudicator ordered Kevin to vacate by May 31st. She also noted that the arrangement had been of no documented benefit to me and awarded me $200 in costs. Kevin stared at the floor when the decision was read. On the way out of the building, he stopped in the hallway and turned to me. He said, quietly enough that only I could hear, "You have no idea what you've done." I looked at him for a moment. "Kevin, I was a Mountie for 32 years. I have a very precise idea of what I've done." I walked to the bus stop. The April air smelled like mud and snow melt, that specific Kingston spring smell I had known my whole adult life. The civil hearing began in May, before a judge of the Ontario Superior Court. Park had retained a forensic accountant, a woman named Miriam Tse, who had spent 20 years reviewing fraud cases for the OSC. Tse's report was 61 pages. She had traced every dollar from the trust account, what came in, what went out, where it went, what it purchased. She built a spreadsheet linking each of Sandra's credit card purchases chronologically to the account withdrawals that funded them. The numbered company in Kevin's name had received $31,000. Tse identified those as fraudulent diversions with full documentary support. Sandra testified. She wore conservative clothing and spoke carefully. She explained that the account was a care management fund, that she had been handling it responsibly, that the expenses were legitimate, but that she had not kept adequate receipts. Under cross-examination, Park asked her to explain how a wine club membership and a Whistler Spa weekend constituted medical care management for a 68-year-old man with a heart condition in Kingston, Ontario. She said those were personal expenses charged in error to the wrong account. Park asked why 48 months of errors had never been caught or corrected. She said she had been very busy. Park then entered the text messages into evidence. Sandra had sent dozens of texts to Kevin over the course of 4 years. In March of the second year, she wrote, "Old man hasn't figured it out. Thinks his pension just doesn't stretch as far as it used to. Keep an eye on things and let me know if he starts asking questions about money." In November of the third year, she wrote, "He applied for help from the church for dental. Good. The more he uses community resources, the less likely he is to scrutinize the account." The judge leaned forward when Park read that one. The judgment came on a Tuesday morning in late June. Park called me, and I drove to his office, which was the first time in months I had driven anywhere that felt like good news waiting at the end. The court found that Sandra Morrison had engaged in a systematic misappropriation of funds designated for my care, that she had deliberately structured the account to prevent my knowledge or access, that her testimony was not credible, and that her conduct demonstrated knowing and intentional deception over a prolonged period. Judgment: $216,000. Principal: $43,000. $200 interest. $9,400 costs and expert fees. Total: $268,600. The counterclaim Sandra had filed against me for defamation and emotional distress was dismissed with costs awarded to me. I sat in Park's office for a moment after he finished reading. He had a coffee waiting, which I drank slowly. "What happens now?" I asked. "Enforcement. Her accounts are already frozen under the Mariva order. We move to satisfy the judgment from the frozen assets. The Kelowna land gets added to the enforcement application. The numbered company's assets are already flagged with the CRA. And Kevin? He's out of your house by end of the month. The $31,000 in the numbered company is part of the enforcement. If he spent it, Sandra is liable for the full amount, regardless." The money came in pieces over the following months. The frozen accounts yielded $89,000 immediately. The Kelowna property was sold, and the proceeds after costs yielded another $58,000. Sandra liquidated a TFSA and several investments under the enforcement order. By September, Park confirmed the judgment had been satisfied in full, minus his contingency fee. My net recovery, after legal costs, and Park's 30%, was $174,000. Not the full $216,000 Sandra had taken, but more than I had ever expected to see again, from a woman who had counted on my not asking the right questions. Kevin left on May 31st with a rented van and the same 3 suitcases he had arrived with. He did not say goodbye. The last thing he did was leave his key on the kitchen counter instead of handing it to me, which I suppose was a small parting statement. I changed the locks the same afternoon, put the new keys on the hook by the back door, where Margaret had always kept them. That evening, I walked through every room of my house, the study where I had spread my evidence across the desk through the coldest months of the winter, the kitchen where Kevin's cereal bowl had sat in my sink for 11 months, the spare room where he had slept, now stripped and clean, smelling of the lavender spray I'd used after opening the windows. I turned off the light in each room as I left it, ended up in the living room, sat in the chair by the window, looked out at Clergy Street in the last of the spring evening light. It had been 6 months since that Christmas morning phone call. 6 months of legal filings, forensic accounting, court dates, and a frozen account in my name that I had never touched. 6 months of Kevin in my kitchen and Sandra's lawyer calling me cognitively impaired in notarized documents. I did not feel victorious exactly. I felt like a man who had finished a long investigation and filed his final report. Daniel flew to Kingston with Lily in July. I picked them up at the airport in my same old Civic, the one with the heater that takes 10 minutes to warm up, and the passenger door that needs lifting slightly to close properly. Lily came through the arrivals door and saw me and ran, the same way she had always run toward me before any of this, before Sandra had started explaining to her in careful terms why Daddy was going away for a while. She hit me around the knees and I lifted her, my back protesting in 3 different places, and I held her there for a moment. She smelled like her shampoo, and like airplane air, and like a child who has no idea yet what adults are capable of doing to each other, which is exactly how a 5-year-old should smell. Daniel's custody application had been filed in March, and the family court evaluation had been completed in June. The evaluator had documented Sandra's pattern of parental alienation, her coaching of Lily's responses, her use of the child's anxiety as leverage in the separation proceedings. The court granted Daniel primary residence. Sandra received structured visitation, supervised for the first 6 months. Daniel didn't tell me the specifics of the evaluation until we were sitting on my front porch that evening with the sun going down behind the houses across the street. He said the evaluator had written that Sandra demonstrated a consistent prioritization of her own interests over her daughter's emotional stability. Courts see through that eventually, I said. Eventually, he agreed. I just wish it had been sooner. When you found out, you didn't hesitate. You didn't ask me to let it go to keep the peace. That matters. He looked at the street. Mom would have known something was wrong from the beginning. Probably, I said. Your mother noticed everything. It was maddening, and I miss it every day. We sat there until Lily came outside in her pajamas because she could hear us talking and didn't want to miss anything. I put her on my lap and pointed out the bats that come out over Clergy Street in the summer evenings, hunting insects in the last light. She watched them with enormous concentration. I had specific plans for the recovery money. I had thought about it through the long winter months when the outcome was still uncertain and the plans had not changed. $100,000 went into an RESP in Lily's name, structured as an irrevocable contribution with Daniel as trustee. The federal government's Canada Education Savings Grant would add 20% to every dollar until she was 17. By the time she was ready for university, it would be enough, fully enough, for whatever she chose. The remaining money went to practical things: a new furnace, which the house had needed for 2 winters, the dental work I had deferred, a winter coat, modest things that would have been ordinary if Sandra had sent a single dollar of what my son had sacrificed for me. Park called in late summer to confirm the final accounting. The CRA had opened a formal audit of the numbered company. The BC Securities Commission had opened a file on Sandra's undisclosed advice to the numbered company. The fraud judgment was a matter of public record, searchable permanently, attached to her name in every background check and credit application she would ever make. She can't escape what's documented, Park said. Justice, I said. That's all I wanted. Through Daniel, I learned that Sandra was renting a 1-bedroom apartment in Surrey, working as a bookkeeper for a small contracting firm at considerably less than her previous income. The wine club, the Whistler trips, the business class flights, that world was gone. Kevin was back in Toronto, reportedly working at a distribution center. The 2 of them, Daniel said, had stopped speaking entirely after it came out that Kevin's affidavit had done nothing but help my case by demonstrating their coordination. I didn't spend much time thinking about them. I had other things to think about. Lily's RESP confirmation letter came in the mail in late August. I put it in my filing cabinet, in the section labeled Family, behind the folder with Lily's birth announcement that Daniel had mailed me the day she was born. I updated my will that month, working with an estate lawyer Margaret's sister had recommended years ago. My house would transfer through a formal trust structure to Daniel and Lily upon my death, bypassing probate and protected from any future claims. The estate lawyer said the structure was sound. On the Labor Day weekend, Daniel brought Lily again, and we drove up to the Thousand Islands to watch the boats. Lily had decided she wanted to know everything about the history of the region, which meant I spent most of the afternoon answering questions about settlers and indigenous peoples, and why the water was that specific shade of green. She had her grandfather's need to understand the mechanics of things. That's what Daniel said, watching her ask a Parks Canada interpreter 3 rapid follow-up questions about canal lock systems. I drove them back to the airport on Sunday evening. At the departures door, Daniel and I stood on the pavement while Lily counted the pigeons near the entrance. "Dad," he said, "I've been thinking about the money. You should have kept more of it." "The money was supposed to help the next generation," I said. "It still will, just differently than Sandra intended." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I should have called you directly every month to confirm. I should have asked you whether it was enough, whether you were managing. I should have done that from the beginning." "You trusted your wife," I said. "That is not a character flaw. That is what marriage requires. When you found out, you stood up. You didn't ask me to let it go. You didn't choose comfort over what was right. That is the man I raised." He gripped my shoulder. Then he went through the doors with Lily, who waved at me from inside the glass with great authority. I drove home in the September evening, down the 401, off on Division Street, through the streets I had patrolled for 32 years. The limestone walls of the old city glowed in the last of the light. I had lived here since I was 26 years old. Margaret had lived here with me for 38 of those years. Our son had grown up here and left, and now his daughter was learning the names of the ducks in the Kataraki the same way he had. I parked in front of my house, sat in the car for a moment. The front door had a new mat. I'd bought it in June, a simple gray one, nothing fancy. The porch boards I had restained in July, working on my knees with a brush on 3 cool mornings. The house looked like itself again, like mine. Inside, I made tea and sat in the living room chair by the window. The street was quiet. A neighbor walked her dog. A kid cycled past under the lamplight. Ordinary Kingston on an ordinary evening. I had spent 8 months building a case the way I had spent 32 years building cases. Methodically, honestly, without losing my temper or my patience. The system had worked because I had given it something to work with. That was all. Evidence properly gathered. Facts correctly presented. The truth told clearly to people whose job it was to hear it. I thought about Lily counting pigeons at the airport door. I thought about her RESP growing quietly in a financial institution 40 minutes from where I was sitting. I thought about Sandra reading a credit application rejection and seeing the judgment against her name in the creditor notes. Then I set my tea down, turned off the lamp, and went to bed. If this story meant something to you, please like this video and subscribe to Subtle Vengeance. Leave a comment and tell me where you're watching from. I read every single one. Click on the video to your left for the next story. Thank you for being here.